Good evening, everyone. Good evening, and welcome to Loyola University, Maryland. I am Terry Sawyer, and I have the pleasure and the privilege of serving as the university's 25th president. Whether you're joining us in person or here with us online, we are delighted that you are spending time with us tonight for this very special lecture. This evening, for our annual Hanway Lecture in Global Studies, we are honored to welcome our guest, the Honorable Lieutenant General Roméo Dallaire. As members of a Jesuit university community, we are well aware that the events around the world have an impact on all of us, and that we also have an impact on people and communities around the world. Our Global Studies program underscores that very connection. The Hanway Lecture invites us to take a closer look at timely, relevant issues that are so important to our world and our lives today. This evening's topic challenges us to consider the state of human rights issues around the world, beginning with the genocide in Rwanda and looking at their intersection with mental health and moral injury. I know we all look forward to hearing from General Dallaire, who is a celebrated advocate for global human rights, as well as a highly respected author, lecturer, leadership consultant, and international advisor. Before we introduce our speaker, I want to express our deep gratitude as an academic and intellectual community to Ellen and Ed Hanway for their very generous gift. Through the Hanway Lecture, we've been able to invite a series of distinguished speakers, scholars, and intellectuals to come to Loyola and to engage us in the important issues of our time. On behalf of all of our students, faculty, and each of us here this evening, I want to thank Ed and Ellen for their investment, not just in this lecture, but in the Global Studies program at Loyola writ large. I also want to thank all my colleagues that have worked so tirelessly on this annual lecture, which elevates the conversations and the discourse here at Loyola. These are truly events that enrich our global perspective and broaden our worldview. I now have the pleasure of inviting Dr. Mary Kate Schneider, the Director of Global Studies and a faculty member in our Political Science Department, to come forward to introduce our speaker, along with our student moderators for this evening. Dr. Schneider.
Thank you, President Sawyer. And thank you to each and every one of you for being with us tonight, both here in McGuire Hall and virtually on the live stream. The Hanway Lecture in Global Studies is an event that we look forward to every year, not least because it allows us to take part in campus and community-wide conversations about critical and timely issues. You don't have to have any specialized expertise to know that world peace remains an elusive goal. If you follow the news, you might feel as though peace is becoming less and less attainable by the day. But this reality is precisely why this conversation tonight is so important. Because although the scope of the world's problems is vast, spanning from wars in Ukraine and the Middle East to climate change, nuclear weapons, and a host of other challenges, our speaker's story shows us that there is still a role for every single one of us to play. If we turn our attention away from the world now, we miss an opportunity to think critically about what that role ought to be. Tonight's conversation invites a somewhat unusual juxtaposition. Our speaker was once a soldier who has come here tonight to talk about the past, present, and future of peace. We don't often think about soldiers when we think about peace, but the fact is, although soldiers fight in wars, they very rarely start them. They know, better than most, the true cost of war. Our speaker this evening is an individual who has witnessed the failures of humanity firsthand and lived to tell about them. General Roméo Dallaire is a celebrated advocate for global human rights. His military career began in the Canadian Army in 1960, and he served in staff training and command positions throughout North America and Europe before being named Force Commander of the United Nations Assistance Mission for Rwanda in 1993. As Force Commander, General Dallaire provided the UN with information about the planned genocide in Rwanda, which ultimately took more than 800,000 lives in 100 days. The UN responded by telling him not to intervene. 3 weeks after the genocide had begun, the Secretary General himself ordered the withdrawal of UN peacekeeping forces from Rwanda. General Dallaire, along with a small contingent of Canadian, Ghanaian, and Tunisian soldiers, disobeyed the command to withdraw and remained in Rwanda to fulfill their ethical obligation to protect those who sought refuge with the UN forces. His courage and leadership during the mission earned him numerous honors, too numerous to list tonight, including the Meritorious Service Cross of Canada, the United States Legion of Merit, and the Aegis Award on Genocide Prevention. His defiant dedication to humanity has been well documented, beginning with his first book, Shake Hands with the Devil: The Failure of Humanity in Rwanda. In 1997, General Dallaire revealed that he suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder as a direct result of his mission in Rwanda, and in 2000, he was medically released from the Canadian Army. Since then, he has dedicated his career to advocacy and leadership. He has advocated tirelessly for the prioritization of mental health and the destigmatization of PTSD as an operational stress injury amongst military veterans and first responders. And he discusses this work in his book, Waiting for First Light: My Ongoing Battle with PTSD. In addition to this, he has also led the charge against the recruitment and use of children in armed conflict, publishing his book, They Fight Like Soldiers, They Die Like Children, and founding the Dallaire Institute for Children, Peace, and Security at Dalhousie University. Threaded throughout each of these initiatives is an unwavering commitment to advancing humanitarian peace. Whether as military commander, senator, or author, General Dallaire works, again, tirelessly to bring national and international attention to situations that are too often ignored, shedding light on critical issues that might more easily be forgotten. General Dallaire, we are so honored to have you with us here tonight. Would you all please join me in welcoming to Loyola University, Maryland, General Roméo Dallaire.
Good evening. I'm so glad Mary Kate used the short version. Well, Monsieur le Recteur, if I may use the French side, I come from Quebec, and so whenever an opportunity of saying a few words in French, I take it, so forgive me for that. Ladies and gentlemen, faculty, students, and friends of the Loyola University here in Maryland, a pleasure to be with you. I'm a senior fellow at the Concordia University, which used to be Sir George Williams University and Loyola College in Montreal, that has now become Concordia. And so there's a bit of a connection there that I permit myself to keep. I spent a year just down the road in Quantico with the Marines, doing my staff college as a foreign officer there. And there was this very, very old Marine colonel. He must have been at least 50. And he said, you can't start a subject that is demanding unless you start it with a joke. And if we didn't have a joke, we would not get a very good mark on our, no matter what the content was. He was so stubborn about this. So I will permit myself a little anecdotal joke, if I may, as we move into a subject that is of extreme seriousness. And really, as the title on all these fantastic posters that were made, based on my last book and Dante's Divine Comedy, peace, past, present, and future. I think that it's most worthy to try to at least set you at ease to start with. Afterwards, if you're troubled by the answers, that makes my day. So when I was still serving, I would be invited to speak at American and many NATO countries on peacekeeping, the new generation peacekeeping, where we move from Chapter 6 as a referee without a red card to Chapter 7 where we're engaged in providing protection to civilians. And so when I'd come to American staff colleges and war colleges and so on, I used to love imitating one of your generals, and that's General Patton. Really, I like to imitate George C. Scott, who played Patton in the movie. And if you ever saw the movie, which is an interesting one, he, right at the start, comes on this stage with a humongous American flag behind him. And he's got all his bells and whistles on and so on. And he says, in the words of the time, "Gentlemen," he says, "the aim is to make the other poor bastard die for his country." And that sort of sets the tone for the combat, the warrior ethic that has dominated militaries from millennia. So when I would go to the staff colleges, I would put a big Canadian flag on the projector. And I'd go to the center of the stage and I'd say, "I come from a country that beat you guys twice." Which immediately called for a lot of wheels to turn. And so I said, yes. I said, in 1775, during your revolution, you came to Canada, you wanted us to join, you attacked General Montgomery with his troops, attacked on New Year's Eve in a snowstorm. He thought we'd all be drunk. We weren't. And he got shot, and we beat you, and you guys went back home. And then the War of 1812. And so there's immediately, somebody would always say, well, no, we won the War of 1812. And I'd say, no, we won it. I said, you guys, you came north and you found this little fort on Lake Ontario called York, which is now Toronto, and you burned it. I'm from Montreal. That doesn't bother me much. I said, we did you guys a favor. We came down, we found this place being built. It's on a swamp. It had malaria. It was hot, humid, mosquitoes all over the place. It was a horrible place to live. So we decided to burn it. And you guys rebuilt it, and it's called Washington. My opinion is Toronto is a reasonable facsimile to say that we won the war. That, of course, doesn't fly at all when a world power capital is, in fact, the other side of the river or the lake. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I'm here for only a few moments to speak before I'm going to be put under the gun by these brilliant young students that are here with prepared questions. And so I was asked to be not too long, 10 to 15 minutes or so. And if you think a retired general who's also a retired senator can be brief, you're in the wrong room. The brevity is not in our lexicon. But I'm going to try to do that. And I'm going to try to do it in the fashion of stating, I hope, a feel for what is troubling us in this era as we move from hell through purgatory to maybe one day paradise, and the work in paradise after going through that ring of fire that Dante did, in search of God, in search of peace. For I would argue, ladies and gentlemen, that humanity has never, ever been at peace. We have been living constantly under truces. We've lived under arrangements. We've never really gone to the entrails of so many of these conflicts and tried to resolve them at the grassroots of what the frictions between us are that do lead, when power and money and authority and the use, and after Westphalia, of course, sovereignty and nation state and nationalism came into play, that guide people to use those powers to conduct war again and ultimately abuse the power that's the result thereof. And in so doing, as the elites come to an agreement, down below the frictions are still there. The differences are still there, just waiting for another circumstance to come back. And so the concept of generational wars is real and is escalating in this time. And so it's not purely national or so on that has moved us to maybe trying to attempt through war to bring peace, which we never achieved. And I would argue that even after World War II, we said we were at peace, but we weren't really at peace, because the next day we had Stalin knocking on the door and launched us into a Cold War for, 40, 50 years. So it wasn't at peace. We haven't had that human security where we can, in fact, all of humanity, which we now can Zoom anybody in the world, we have never had that opportunity to not have to look at our 6 o'clock, to be wanting ultimately of a sense of being able to project our freedoms, our rights, and to maximize our potential as the human race. For now we can actually talk to the whole of the human race. This is the first time in history we can do real time the whole human race. And in so doing, we can bring credence to the argument that all humans are human. That there isn't one human more human than the other. And yes, we have nuances and differences that create frictions, and we could resolve them if we had the ability to understand the circumstances that surround these frictions and find other than power ultimately to resolve them, which has been the basis of so much of the decision-making internationally and institutions around the world, as the male side of the house has dominated the world. The male have created the institutions, have created the dogmas, the references for all of humanity. And that sort of male domination has kept the women in that secondary role, of which some have broken through. But essentially, we have not, over the years with all our institutions, been very effective at preventing conflicts, at actually achieving lasting peace. Not just peace, but lasting peace. And so we're stumbling into an era that I would argue would be nearly revolutionary, if not revolutionary, in which the men have pushed through our philosophies and our actions and our way of thinking and our decision-making and what influences us, have reached a sort of an apogee, a summum, that now needs an injection of a whole new set of parameters that can, with the men, create a new philosophy of leadership in the world, that may, in fact, create a new statespersonship that can bring a new leadership, even with a new lexicon. And so that ultimately, humanity may in communion with the planet to not just help us survive, but make us thrive, that we could actually achieve peace and then go to the next level of lasting peace and then ask ourselves, okay, now what's the aim? Now that we've achieved lasting peace, is it purely to populate this planet? Is there another role, dimension to humanity? Is there something we haven't even had the opportunity to seriously look at in the universe because we have so often stumbled back into purgatory, and some of us are still in hell in the war. And so I've been to hell. I have, as my first book says, shaken the hands of the devil. It was not a hand that was human. It was, in figuratively speaking, or as we see it, a person with blood-spattered shirt and a hand as the leader of the militias that were doing the slaughtering in Rwanda. There was something about that hand that did not make it feel human. And in the eyes, there was something behind it that was sort of yelling at you, screaming at you. And I nearly went for my pistol, only to realize that wisely had not brought my pistol with me, because I would have probably shot them. I shook the hand of evil as, on the third night of the genocide, my headquarters was chock-a-block full of Tutsi and internally displaced persons who needed protection, and I had just a few troops with me. I was looking out the window of my office, and all of a sudden a sort of a bit of air, or like a veil, sort of just came by my face. And within a nanosecond, I changed from being under siege and hopefully be able to protect, and maybe ultimately we would be eliminated, because that was the aim of the extremist government, and changed it to more of a positive, offensive, and determined perspective of making sure that that didn't happen. And so I know there's also a force of good. In the hell, we face enormous amount of ethical, moral, and legal dilemmas in so many of these conflicts, from mandates to resources to the debate on who the good guy and bad guy is, and so on. And it is true that the Secretary General, within 3 weeks, when people thought that, oh, this is just a tribal problem in Africa, we expect that, a couple of weeks, they'll kill each other for a while, and then we'll throw some cash at it and send the NGOs in, and then things will be back to normal. But it wasn't happening that way. It was escalating, exponentially escalating. And so the Secretary General did call me up and said, the world cannot handle the death of about 450 peacekeepers, Blue Berets, that's all I had left. And I responded without thinking. It was an instinctive response from my values, my way of living, my family, my church, my schooling, my whole background. Got an instinctive reaction, and I said, no, we're not going. And he hung up. Not used to people hanging up on him, but that is of saying no to him. He did it again, and then his chief of staff said, do you call me up and said, do you realize you are now a rogue commander? You've said no to a legal order. And so you are responsible for the lives of those soldiers, and you are a rogue commander. And I said, I'm fully aware of that, and I hung up on him. Then I had to ask the troops individually, through the different commanders, if they would follow a rogue commander, because by law they should not. They would have to volunteer, which they did. And they stayed with me. And we saved directly about 32,000 and God knows others, but we ultimately failed to prevent the genocide, which was not our mandate, but we should have been able to do far more. But the world did not want to do more because the world didn't really give a damn about a little country in Africa that had no strategic value, and the countries who came and looked at it didn't even want to give me anything. And in fact, one representative of a country said, hey, there's nothing here. And on top of that, it's overpopulated. So we're not going to take the risks, and we won't come. And so they didn't. And nobody came. No ammunition came, no food, no water came. For the next month and a half, and then the French came. But they had a different ambition as the next colonial power that we had to curtail and get rid of, for they were exacerbating the situation when they arrived. And so, ladies and gentlemen, it was a legal order, but it was immoral. We had abandoned those 32,000. They would have been slaughtered as one country pulled out before we gave orders, and 4,000 were killed in less than 2 hours. So it was immoral. And that is the arena in which we stumbled into after the Cold War. In a number of failing states and imploding nations, as the protection of civilians and the use of civilians as sort of bartering took hold in many, many countries as dictators were being dispossessed or reinforced throughout the era that we thought was peace, right? The end of the Cold War. George Bush Sr. said, hey, we entered a new world order. No, we stumbled into a new world disorder. It caught us by surprise. We couldn't figure out who really was running what. And in so doing, permitted so many to do so much more hurt and catastrophes. And since then, we tried to find solutions, like the concept in 2000, well, first, the creation through the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court in Den Haag, and that was a great asset to try to bring justice. And I testified for the Arusha one, which ultimately was the jurisprudence for helping that court to come to being. And then the concept of responsibility to protect, which said that it was no more the state that was sovereign, it was the individual human being is sovereign. And when the individual's human rights are being massively abused, then it is the responsibility of the rest of humanity to engage and to go in and protect them, irrelevant of the concept of sovereignty of a nation. Well, we tried it in Libya, but the UN didn't have the command and control, and NATO took over, and it went haywire. And we had regime change instead of protecting civilians and a complete dislocation of the region. But then 2005, responsibility to protect was the only reform that made it through the Permanent Five to bring the UN into the era in which we had just stumbled into and try to get ahead of the game to try to prevent these catastrophes from happening. But nobody wants to use it. The big powers don't want to use it because it drags them into things they're not keen on, and the smaller powers are worried that the big powers will abuse it and create regime changes. And so we've got this extraordinary tool available that would permit us to go into countries that are failing and protect the civilians and assist in hopefully preventing a catastrophe. And we're not using it. We're not using it in the Middle East. We're not using it in Ukraine. I'm just back now with my wife for 2 weeks in Ukraine, of which I spent half of the time in the front lines. With the troops, the commanders, the injured, the families, the destroyed villages, the fear, the destruction, the attrition of the morale of those people, because it's an attrition war. The harassing fire that keeps coming down everywhere just to continue to harass and keep people on edge and wear them down. But there's something that I will come to a bit of a conclusion, because there's, I'm being told to. What we're doing in Ukraine is really not much more than what we did to assist me in Rwanda 30 years ago. Oh, we're throwing ammunition at it and equipment and the like. But the day that the Russians came across that eastern border should have been the day that NATO crossed the western border and stood there and called the bluff of tactical nukes on Putin. And so it is Ukrainians who are being slaughtered, massively abused in their human rights, abuses of international law, humanitarian law, law of armed conflict, the use of children, young children in the war, 14-year-olds running drones and guiding them to kill. We are not getting our boots dirty. On the contrary, a lot of the NATO countries who had been weakened during the Cold War, during the peace after the Cold War, because soft conflict, soft war was more it. We wanted to demobilize, felt that they weren't able maybe to intervene, but really it was a great excuse for not having to take these difficult decisions of taking casualties in a country that was not part of NATO, but is certainly in the front lines of the divisions that are going on now in Europe. It suited us to be bluffed and not put our boots on the ground. And so, ladies and gentlemen, there is a war there that's expanding itself with North Korea, Iran, the Chinese, and a number of other countries that are participating and assisting the Russians, and with NATO punching stuff in. But in the end, when you look at the Ukrainians and the destruction of their morale, their being, all you're seeing is ultimately some sort of truce will be established. Some line will be drawn. And all the lands that have been taken over by the Russians will be whatever they're doing. And the rest of it will stay Ukrainian, and they'll join NATO, and it will try to rebuild, and the 8 million might come back that are now evacuated. And the 20-odd million that are still there are going to try to live with the traumas of war and the destruction and try to stabilize until the next time, when another exercise will start and we'll have another phase that will take away what we thought might be a peaceful sort of resolution, but really it won't be. It'll be some accepted, tolerated solution that is a truce that is just initiated another level of generational wars as the young people of that country will become adults, and then all the hurt and all the loss and so on will appear. And the over 1 million veterans and families and the hundreds of thousands who have been killed already or mutilated will start to relive the war. For their injuries will increase as the war ends. They'll still be fighting the war because there won't be the stress and the urgency there anymore, and so that gives them time to let all these things come back and they will relive the war for decades, and their families will relive it for decades. And so, ladies and gentlemen, yeah, war is hell. But war is such an inept instrument that all our processes have come as a solution, we think, to some of the frictions that separate us or that permit or don't permit us to go for the greed that we want. And I would argue that two things are going to change that. One, women will become equal, and they will change the nature of decision-making and the doctrine and the philosophy of peace and search of peace that has been dominated by men for 20,000 years of slaughtering each other. And the second one is that the young generation, the Zeds and the millenniums and so on, are the generation without borders. They're already global, and they will not tolerate anymore hundreds of billions going into nuclear weapons, which are absolutely useless, and pennies going into ensuring a communion with the planet to permit us to thrive and get us out of that negative philosophy of trying to survive. And so this is an abridged version of 4 hours of lectures, and you're very lucky that it's only a few minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, General Dallaire. At this time, I'd like to invite our student moderators to the stage, Global Studies majors Quinn Vaughn and Maeve Hill. We'll proceed with moderated discussion.
All right. Hi there, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, General Dallaire. So, you spoke in your lovely sort of summation of the nature of conflict today about the general strokes of how it is a threat to all of us. But tell me, in your view, what is the biggest threat to global peace and stability today?
I'm not sure people can see us in the back there, and I'm not going to pull a Robin Williams on you and dance all over the stage, but I feel more comfortable responding, if I may, standing. It's a bad habit that generals have. Of course, it's also in senators because we've got to stand up to speak in the House. So, and your question is most pertinent because I think the greatest deficiency that we have now is there is no leadership in the world. There isn't a statesman out there. The political elites are limited, and their scale of comprehending and inventing and innovating in order to anticipate better, to prevent catastrophes instead of continuously being surprised by them, is just not anymore in there. No matter how many intellectual exercises are done, or humanitarian exercises, or NGO efforts that are done, we simply have not been able to build statesmanship or statespersonship that can have the humility, that has the courage of taking risks, and has the ability to communicate with people to the extent of mobilizing their desire, sustained desire, to be able to go and take the risks and pay sometimes the price of establishing peace. And so this dearth of leadership in the world has got to be, or near vacuum, has got to be filled. And I believe that that's part of this thinking that I am projecting, that we've got to bring the whole of humanity into the exercise and not just half of it. That is to say, women and men as equals, engaged fully in rewriting, redefining the philosophical frameworks that we're using, the sort of the doctrines that are the basis of many of our institutional references in order to be able to fill this very complex and ambiguous era with solutions that I believe we haven't even come close to broaching. We are still stumbling in a very complex and ambiguous era. And so our greatest failing now is not having the leadership that can guide us and move us and sustain that. Sustain it in order to be able to move towards peace someday.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for that answer. I want to take a pivot and go from more the international scale to more local government in Rwanda. You mentioned that it's important, obviously, for women and men to be in government to be seen as equal. As you may know, Rwanda is one of the first countries to have a majority female parliament. And I was wondering what your take is on that of the female parliament, as well as President Kagame as a Tutsi president in Rwanda today.
I said there's no holds barred tonight, and so that's very fine. And no problem with me at all. That we be as candid as we want to be in responding. The first part of your question in regards to women in Rwanda, it is true that women in Rwanda are being pushed to continue to thrive, to take on more and more leadership roles, and they are doing that. In the whole spectrum of disciplines of a society. But as the minister at the time of justice, I believe she was at that time, told me, she said, during the day I'm the minister of justice and I'm equal and I have my responsibilities and work with my colleagues and so on. But she says, when supper comes, I'm the one who makes supper. I'm the one who washes the dishes. I'm the one who takes care of the children. And so, although they're moving professionally, we're still instilling in our youth that the women sort out those problems. And just look in your families, you know, one of the children has a scrape or something. Who did they turn to? Dad? Not likely. And so right from the start, we turn to the women to that. And so they acquire, yes, more and more, and they're engaged more and more, and it's creating so much more demands on them because they haven't lost or been able to balance the other responsibilities that have been traditional, structured in their societies where they are to provide services to the family in a variety of ways. So there's a lot going on two planes for bringing the women up to the scale, I think, of equals. But I see the young generations being far more balanced in doing that. And for that, I applaud and wish you well in pursuing that. In regards to General Kagame, first of all, he would never call himself a Tutsi president because he, in trying to solve the reconciliation problem, essentially said, listen, we're all talking the same language, same religion, same backgrounds, okay, varying degrees depending on who was the colonial power at the time and pre-colonial power. And so we're all Rwandans. And we'll talk Kinyarwanda, and we'll talk English, and now they're talking also French. How successful has he been in integrating the two? Well, that's certainly debatable. But it is a solution that is so much better than what, in fact, we have been trying to impose solutions in many of these ex-colonies. That is to say, here you got a country that was 150, nearly 150 years under colonial rule, who fiddled with both ethnicities in power. Then it had 25, nearly 30 years of a dictator, 3 years of a civil war, mass atrocities that were going on left, right, and center. And then we come in and we say, okay, we're going to help you establish a peace agreement. And by the by, we want you to have a democratic elected government in 2 years. Someone couldn't even spell democracy. The toing and froing of opponents, not as enemies, but opponents. The giving and the adjusting so that the debate in the institutions brings discipline and content to whatever the decisions have to be taken in regards to advancing the country. Not enemies. They're not enemies. They're opposition and in power. Well, that takes a hell of a big level of sophistication in trying to make that work, to make it understood. And the proof of that was when I was there was an election in Canada, and a French Canadian, which is a minority in Canada, was elected Prime Minister above an English Canadian opponent. They could not understand how that's possible. That is to say, the extremists and the hardliners of the Hutu side of the house. So I agree. He won his election with 99%, that there is a benevolent autocrat there, and that is he preparing a dauphin to transition his country, building a middle class, bringing in education for all, medical help, work, and then ultimately stabilize it enough that he can hand it over to then transition to democracy. And I kind of accept that better than trying to create a democratic institution and have divisions right from the start that create, in fact, more frictions and ultimately find yourself going back to war. So I give him, good marks for pulling the country to become, in fact, the Singapore of Africa. But yeah, it'll be time, certainly soon, that the democratic youth that have been born after the genocide be given far more room to be able to come and take over. And by the by, the women are very much in that integrated solution. Those are my short answers. I hope that.
Excellent. Well, you mentioned the role of youth multiple times in your answer, and given that we're in front of an audience of students primarily, I was curious what you feel the role of our up-and-coming generation and the generation after us will be to essentially solve these issues that can feel so insurmountable now when we're students looking at them from a position of very little power.
This might make the president a little nervous. In the 60s, we fiddled at that. And those of you who followed Doonesbury, remember Doonesbury from Yale, and how often Slackmeyer took over the president's office? I'm not saying become activists and take over the president's office. Maybe he wants a bit of time off, and it might be a good idea, I don't know. But I do firmly believe that the youth, the sort of 18 to 30, 33-ish, don't realize that they are the balance of power in their democracies. I am for the vote to go to 16. If we're teaching them what democracy is and what the institutions are, then they should be able to exercise it. And if we have politicians who are fearful that 16-year-olds are going to throw them out of office, that politician's got a problem. However, when you look at how our democracies are evolving, we notice that the youth do not vote. And I'll use my country as an example. In the last election, remember, we're only 35 million there, but in the last election, those between the ages of 18 and 30, very few voted. In fact, 1.9 million votes were never used at that election, but when you go back, it's never been used before either, because we didn't vote when we were young. That 1.9 million set of votes is the balance of power that they can, by mastering the technologies of communications and real time and being able to coalesce far more than we've ever been able to do, they could shift the nature of politics in our countries if they voted en masse. And so I don't accept that the youth don't have power. I argue they don't use it. And yes, I am for activism. The causes can be just, and they can be expressed. But within the nature of our societies, with all the tools that are permitted to be able to become activists and to bring change. So the first thing, however, is to realize the power that the students have and to use it at the elections. And then after that, you can then exercise it not only locally, but collectively as you shift your country into another gear. So I have a lot of time for the young people, a lot of time for them, because they're impatient, they want to change things far more, and they got better tools than we ever had to be able to do that and to implement it. And so it's up to them to use it and to be encouraged. And yes, we can mentor. We with gray hair. And so, yeah, we can mentor. We can respond. And they'll be smart enough to query, I'm sure. And those in the generations that are between us with a lot of gray hair and them, well, maybe you're going to have to move aside a bit because they're coming down the road and they'll want change due to the impatience they have that's been instilled by the technological and societal changes that have permitted them to express it. And I think they want to.
Thank you for that. As you mentioned before, that you said that activism is a key role for youth to play in the participating in society. I'm wondering how, compared to peace building, I would say that activism and peace building both play a major role in creating relationships. And I'm wondering what your thoughts on, or what your experience has been on seeing societies foster positive relationships to further peace within this community.
That's a difficult question for me because I have been spending most of my time in conflict countries. My work with child soldiers in Africa are continuously under stress because of continued coups and changes and trying to bring about a far more respectful and recognizing of human rights that the youth have in their countries. And so I find it difficult to say, how do we find that peace building exercise go on? I'm trying to argue that if we, as we look into that future of humanity, if we can only recognize one element, and that element is that we are all equal. When Rwanda was going on, I couldn't get any reinforcements, any ammunition, any food, water from the UN. because all the nations in the world were not giving anything to the UN to be able to give to me. Remembering the UN is us. And so there was no will to do that, to help us solve that problem. But at the same time, in ex-Yugoslavia, we poured 67,000 troops. And all we did was set a truce between those three, because if you go there now, there's no resolution, there's just truce. They're tolerating each other by not talking to each other. And so, in my perspective, when you look at a continent like Africa, where populations are sometimes 50% 15 and under, that the youth movement in African nations is going to be an enormous potential for bringing resolution into the future. Because as my personal experiences are, and even my son who's done peacekeeping in Sierra Leone and even Haiti, there is a desire by young people not to play by the old rules of privilege and graft and so on. That they want not to have battalions of us to help them secure themselves, but they're looking for professionalism, the content, to adapt it to their culture, to their milieu, and to be able to use, some technology in order to move their nation forward. And so that desire is alive there. Our perspective is simply trying to throw things at them and impose things, while in fact what they're looking for is simply help us with some of the solutions. But treat us as equals. Don't treat us as another power. I was in Darfur in 2005. 200,000 plus were slaughtered in Darfur. The Janjaweed were a militia that the Sudanese, the Arab-based Sudanese government, funded by the Chinese who were buying their oil, they were raping and killing and slaughtering, destroying villages left, right, and center. Youths, they're using kids to do that. And so in that scenario, where people were being killed and raped and slaughtered and so on, we were getting next to no support to try to stabilize. Even Médecins Sans Frontières had given up on that. At that same time, remember there was a tsunami in Indonesia. Killed over 100,000, I believe. The whole world mobilized to go to the tsunami. Nobody, nothing came to Darfur. And not only that, but the solution that the UN and the European Union had come up with was a comprehensive peace agreement between the rebels and who were African-based Sudanese and the Arab-based Sudanese who wanted to eliminate the African-based Sudanese. The solution was a comprehensive peace agreement. And when you looked at it, it had nothing on women and nothing at all on women and nothing on children. Not a word of how they can be brought into a comprehensive peace agreement. Well, I've just published an article in the New York Times on Darfur that's now going back up and exploding once again. We had a truce somewhat, but it's now returned again to the massacring and the killing. So I do believe we can move the yardsticks forward, because I do believe that there is a period now that I would even call revolutionary, that the youth are going to be taking more and more and more and more place, and that we will stop simply sort of using them as examples every now and again in our organization, but we'll start holding them accountable for engaging and changing what is happening in the world and moving us towards not just peace, but lasting peace. And that's a sign that I've talked too long.
Thank you. Thank you once again, General Dallaire, and a huge thank you to our moderators, Maeve and Quinn. We do want to make sure that we can take some questions from you here in the audience, and so I think we have a micro. The lights are really bright. I think we have a microphone that we're going to place in the center aisle, and if you do have questions, it would be great if you could just come right down the aisle, line up behind the microphone, and we can hear a little bit more of what General Dallaire has to say this evening. Please, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. So you mentioned your own faith at one point. How does faith inform your understanding of these horrific events as you try to move towards peace? And how do you see faith-based action as a major factor in peace building in the future?
At one point with my injury, PTSD, when I went public with it, and fought the stigma of being injured psychologically and being walking wounded. I was still serving, and I was trying to figure out how come I got injured like that. And as a two-star general, what happened there? And we didn't have much therapy at all in that, even though I ultimately went to the Veterans Administration here in White River Junction in Vermont, which had a big PTSD clinic there, who said, to guide me, they said, yeah, we're going to help you build the clinics and so on, get the therapists going, because we don't want you to live what we're living. And I said, what's that? They said, we got 58,000 so many names on that extraordinary monument just down the road. By 1997, 22 years after the Vietnam War, there were over 102,000 suicides directly related to Vietnam and counting. When you went to that little clinic there, it was a big hospital, the only change in those people that were there, those ex-soldiers, men and women, was that their hair was gray. They were dressed the same way, they still acted, they were still in Vietnam. And those boogeymans were coming digitally clear and in slow motion, and they were reliving still their experience of Vietnam. So where faith comes in is I felt that there was something lacking. And I went to another great movie, by pure chance, Gettysburg. Extraordinary movie. And in that, the constant expression of the Christian believing generals and how they spoke and how they believed in God and how they felt the presence and their duties and responsibility, but how they lived with that. I felt that's an extraordinary strength individually that you have. And so with the Chaplain General of the Canadian Forces, I said, we have got to find a way to bring back spirituality into the officer corps. Because the practicing Christians or whatever religion were few and far between. And so they didn't have another reference inside that could help them handle those ethical and moral dilemmas that are eating away at them like cancer and destroying them and destroying their families. And so we tried to convince them to create a sort of ecumenical type of place in which we could bring into the officer corps that depth. And it could be religious, it could be simply spiritual. Your inner being speaking to you, that other inner being. And so I believe that it is critical that we have that other us inside us, that we can, in fact, count on, fall back on, build on, and sustain us as we try to repair the injuries and reduce sometimes the impacts of those injuries in us. But you know what happened? When I tried to get that introduced to our military college, like West Point, that have now all my archives of the genocide in Rwanda are now at West Point, I went to the leadership to say we got to build this sort of atmosphere and create a capability of committing to this. And they weren't interested. They were just interested in building more beds and rooms for the cadets to have a better way of life inside the institution than actually trying to help them create depth in their being to handle the demands that are going to be ever increasing on them being able to accomplish their mission in their profession of arms. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir.
Earlier you mentioned that there is no leadership in this world. Sorry, I'm kind of short. Earlier you mentioned that there is no leadership in this world, and that is a void that needs to be fulfilled and sustained, and also that needs to bring in the whole of humanity. I was wondering what this leadership would look like. That is, would it be a reformed UN or another form of intergovernment organization?
What a great question. In 1997, Boutros Ghali, who was not an effective Secretary General of the UN, was replaced by a guy called Kofi Annan, who'd come up through the ranks in the UN. And his appointment was strongly supported by the Americans, French, Canadians, and so on. And he proved to be helpful in ex-Yugoslavia and a few other problem areas. But in the midst of moving towards his second term, or possibility of second term, which the post-millennium time, the United States went to him and said, we're going to back you up and to stay on, but we want you to present to us a reformed UN. What are and how can we implement massive reforms in the UN? Everything from the composition of the Security Council to what are we hiring, what the use of the resources, and on and on and on and on. Into the entrails of the institution from leadership downward. So he did. He produced a list of nearly 100 recommendations. 3 months before the 2005 General Assembly, one of the permanent 5 vetoed all the recommendations. So they were never presented at the General Assembly for implementation. Guess what country vetoed it?
Was it the United States?
It's a gentleman who had a white mustache, who was ambassador at the time. Bolton. Yeah. But it was the administration, of course. Vetoed the whole lot. But what's worse is that nobody's picked up afterwards. The only thing that got through was responsibility to protect, which was massive in regards to sovereignty of nations, but nobody wants to use it. So that has kept the UN at what some really wanted to be as either the scapegoat or a busybody entity instead of being the real reason, which is keep the 5 powers from going to war and preventing conflicts around the world by building up the human security dimension of humanity. So how do we build that leadership and how we construct it? I think a lot has got to do with our will as nations to let leaders come and be and permit to lead, and permit us to debate the content of our problems and not the peripheral problems that the media are concentrating on and to which have subordinated the politicians because they're worried about what's on the next 15-second or 15-minute news, and so they're risk adverse, and so they don't take the initiative. And so putting the media back in its place of informing in the complexity of things going, and stop treating us like grade 9 students and dumbing down stuff. And secondly, regenerating the intellectual depth and rigor of a nation to want to see leadership come to the fore based on extraordinary skills and not on cash. Big steps, eh? Big steps. These days make me very nervous, make my country very nervous. We are worried. One idiot even said we should build a wall. But anyways, we are worried. The world power is ripping itself apart. How in the hell do you think we're going to survive? You know, they said they did, when I lost, when I wanted to go and attack the extremists who had arms caches, and they refused, and the troops and the countries did not want me to use the few troops I had. I wasn't allowed to because they're loaned to the UN at the time. I could not go and prevent that. And why? Because a few months earlier, 19 Rangers were dragged through the streets of Mogadishu, Somalia. And they were worried that all I would do is fall into a trap and have more blue berets, and then the UN would get a black nose, and then the Americans would not pay their dues, and so on and so on. So they refused us to be able to do something proactively because of that. And so we can come to the fore, but it needs a reform that is nearly revolutionary. And that's where you young people come in, and that's where the women stop imitating male philosophies of leadership and bring your woman philosophy of leadership to integrate with the male philosophy and create a new humanity philosophy of leadership. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, our time together is very rapidly dwindling, so we do have to wrap things up.
May I say one last word?
Please.
You put a microphone in front of a general, you're in trouble. I promised the president an anecdote, not to embarrass him, of course. When I was doing my research at the Kennedy School, I was invited to go to Boston College, which is, of course, also a Jesuit university. And the rector, the president there, had invited me to speak to the faculty and students on the Rwandan genocide and factors surrounding the Rwandan genocide. And this is in 2004. And so he said, send me the title, the next days, and we'll make the publicity. I said, fine. So I sent him the title, and the title was The Complicity of the Catholic Church in the Rwandan Genocide. You can imagine, I'm sure you are, what kind of result that produced. However, in the true depth of the Jesuit philosophy and its strength and its ability to, even with the strength and rigor it has, the flexibility and the courage that's inherent in that philosophy, he accepted that I present that and argued how the Catholic Church had split the two ethnicities, one against the other in the schools and in the institutions, that the Catholic Church of Rwanda had been subsumed by the politicians and was being used by the politicians. The Pope came there a couple of years before, but it didn't help at all. And so it was a very powerful session. But what made the difference, I think, was a woman. What permitted me to be able to do and express that was a woman, it was a nun who was on the academic staff, who wrote a book that was just published a couple of weeks before I was to give my speech, that argued in far more detail how the Catholic Church of Rwanda had erroneously lost its way and had, in fact, been in too many ways complicit in setting the stage for what had happened. And so, sir, thank you for permitting me on your campus to talk of revolution. That is very, very courageous of you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you once again, General Dallaire. Thank you so much. Your relentless faith in humanity's greater purpose, particularly in light of everything that you have witnessed during your career, is really and truly very inspiring to us. And so thank you once again for being here with us this evening. Please join me once again thanking our speaker as well as our student moderators.
I'm going to finish with a joke then. It's I'm a French Canadian, so I had to learn English in a Cub. I was in a Cub Pack, which was in an English Protestant school, and I was Catholic French Canadian. So on Tuesday nights I went to Cubs, and on Wednesday mornings I went to confession. And they decided to teach me some English, and so they taught me a rhyme. It's not offensive, but it goes like this: when you're out with your honey and your nose is a runny, don't think it's funny, because it's not.
At our Jesuit Institution of Higher Learning, we are committed to deepening our knowledge. So thank you for helping us do that here this evening. We are so grateful for you sharing your experience and your time with us. General Dallaire has generously offered to share even more of his time with us this evening with a book signing at the table right over there. So if you would like him to sign your books, please line up over there. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening, and have a wonderful night.